Hi there everyone, welcome to the first video for week number 4. For this week we're going to be talking a little bit about some of Descartes' later philosophy as well as Margaret Cavendish. Actually, while I'm going to be giving you a brief introduction to some relevant aspects of Descartes' philosophy, the next two videos we are so lucky to be able to have a guest presenter, a dear friend of mine named Kevin Lower. He is a PhD student at Villanova, and he specializes in early modern philosophy. And so he, speaking frankly, he's the one who really got me into early modern philosophy and helped me fall really deeply in love with it. And so I wanted the opportunity to be able to share that with you all as well. And so that's going to be really, really exciting for this week. So this video is more about, really closing the chapter, tying the knot on our own assessment of Descartes just by looking at some material from his later philosophy. In particular, we're going to be talking about the principles of philosophy and an important theoretical framework that he develops there for talking about metaphysics or ultimate reality. As we're going to see, these concepts are important not only for Cavendish and the way that the thinkers of this period think about like science and physics. It's also sort of the essential building blocks of their metaphysical theories, right? So far in Descartes, we've talked a lot about God, and we've talked a lot about Descartes' skepticism and the cogito and so on, right? In Descartes' dualism, but we haven't given a synoptic picture of how those all come together, especially in his later works. Sorry, I got tripped up by my wording there. Okay, but that's okay. So we're going to, talk about these aspects of Descartes' theory. It's going to be very important that you try your best to remember this vocabulary and really try to understand it, because we're going to see it come up in Cavendish, as you're going to see in the later videos, but we're also going to see it come up importantly in later philosophers that we discuss. So like next week, we're going to start discussing Spinoza, and he was extremely influenced by these moments in Descartes' philosophy that we're going to be talking about today. And so basically, by going over these essential concepts, we're going to be preparing the way for understanding Cavendish, preparing the way for understanding Spinoza, and then appreciating how these philosophers change and transform the central concepts of Cartesian philosophy. And this is really, in general, how we're going to see the development of modern philosophy, is that philosophers are going to sort of look at the conceptual options that were given to them by their predecessor. They're going to make some changes, for whatever reason, right? We'll talk about different kinds of motivation. Sometimes it's to better account for scientific theories. Sometimes it's to preserve important insights, moral insights about the soul and so on, right? And so we're going to examine different kinds of motivations for transforming these concepts as they initially emerge in Descartes, but then this whole series of transformations in the early modern period. So that's kind of what's on the agenda for today. Oh, also, one thing I would like to briefly note about next week's readings. Next week reading, you have a short reading by an author named Pierre Bayle. And the way that he wrote that text is a little confusing. You're going to see several different paragraphs. Like, he essentially wrote like very long and weird footnotes. And so basically what I want you to follow is the main body of text, where he's talking about Spinoza and calling Spinoza an atheist. And we're going to critically examine that claim over the next few weeks. that's just as a little preparation for next week. Okay. So what do we need to do now? Up here, I've written Descartes' later philosophy, and we're going to begin with the left half of the board. And this says Descartes' later philosophy, and here I've written Descartes' principles of philosophy. So I think that I may have mentioned at some point in class that around the years 1630 or so, Descartes was in the process of writing a multi-volume work that would sort of lay out his own vision of the world, and he called it The World, appropriately. He seemingly thought that he had come up with, the essential stuff that you need to understand about the world, right? And it would include metaphysics, physics, medicine, and so on, right? Important theological truths would be included as well. But he halted working on this work whenever he saw what was happening with Galileo's Inquisition. And so, he's worried about essentially ruffling the feathers of religious authorities, and then he produces the Meditations, right? Which begins, as we've mentioned a few times, with his dedicatory letter to the Sorbonne, where he says, essentially, don't disdain the fact that I'm doing philosophy because I'm going to be demonstrating the truths of Christianity, right? The truths of his own religion. And so the Principles of Philosophy you can think about as a work that comes much later in Descartes' career, but where he is kind of in some ways trying to realize the same project that he had in the work that he called The World, right? It's going to be a multi-volume work. It's going to cover essential topics in metaphysics and theology and physics and so on and so forth, right? It'll be sort of all-encompassing. This period is where we really see the development of the sort of literary form of the encyclopedia, right? That was sort of tied up with the Enlightenment project. It's like, we don't need to rely on dogma to discover the nature of the world. Instead, we can gather and assemble all of this information to be able to distribute to everyone, right? I mean, you can think about our contemporary analog of the encyclopedia, which is Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is in some ways just the completion of this Enlightenment project, or a universal encyclopedia. That's the reasoning not like of a particular person or sect, but is supposed to just provide general information that should be, not controversial to anyone, right? But if you know anything about like the inside scoop on Wikipedia, then you know that there are conflicts constantly, right? So even though it is the realization of this Enlightenment idea in some respects, it certainly is not happening the way that they envisioned. Anyway, that's just to say that Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, I think, can rightly be thought to belong to this encyclopedia tradition, right? And so in that way, it's supposed to be a synoptic overview of his thinking, right? And this is very important because we have to think about its difference from the Meditations and also understand why Descartes thought the Meditations was his most important philosophical text and that this was not, right? Why, right? This one seems like it has more information. It seems like it's ordered in a way that is like easier to digest, right? Why this instead? Well, why do you prefer the Meditations, which by comparison seems a little jumbled and unorganized, compared to this, which is nicely, sectioned out and so on and so forth, right? Well, Descartes thinks that the difference between the two works stems primarily from their method of construction, right? Like, how did he write the Meditations versus how did he write the Principles? And importantly, we're going to see this distinction between an analytic and synthetic method reappear. And for those of you who have had other philosophy classes, you may think that this is the same thing as the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. It is not the same thing, importantly. We will discuss that and those distinctions whenever we're near the end of the semester and talking about cons. But I just want to signal, you might already be familiar with some of these words because of other classes, right? This is an importantly different concept, right? Okay, so synthetic method, not synthetic judgment, so on, right? So what is a synthetic method? Well, what makes a synthetic method, and here, we can contrast it with what we might call an analytic method. So, in analysis, where the word analysis comes from is the breaking of things apart, right? Whereas synthesis is the coming of things together, right? And so essentially the difference between a synthetic and an analytic method is the order that you follow, the order under which you present things. Where do you start and where do you go, right? And the way that Descartes thinks about it is that the synthetic method follows the order of topics. Sorry, I wrote order of topics again here, but this should say order of reasons. So what is this distinction, right? The distinction between the order of topics and the order of reasons. It's the difference between how things really are and how they have to appear to me. The synthetic method begins with how things really are, right? And you, in the principles, right, you get God before you get the cogito, right? Whereas in the meditation, to get the cogito and then you get God, right? What is the distinction? Well, the analytic method doesn't begin with the assumption of any kind of knowledge, and it takes it as necessary to demonstrate that there is knowledge, right? And so it follows in order of reasons. It discovers the most fundamental or essential principles by deducing them, right? The principles, by contrast, is like Descartes sort of giving like a primer, right, for natural scientists and stuff like that. People that really can't be bothered with the philosophical questions that are raised like in the first meditation, right, about skepticism and so on, but who are more like, well, I just want to know what Descartes thought. I don't really care how he got there, right? I want to know about the topic. I want to know what Descartes thought about God or matter or, whatever. I don't really care as much how he gets there, right? And this is part of why, like, the meditations is a long-running and continuous kind of argument, whereas the principles is cut up into these little sections, right? He is sort of like just drawing out implications. He's not really providing justifications or anything like that, right? And so the principles of philosophy follows a synthetic method, and so is ordered by topics. By contrast, the meditations follows an analytic method, and therefore follows the order of reasons, right? It discovers the fundamental sort of like primitive truths, primitive in the sense of you cannot get anything more basic, right? And that is why Descartes thinks about the meditations as being his sort of like essential philosophical text, and the principles as being like him explaining the results of his philosophy to those who, either can't or won't go through the difficulty of the demonstrations themselves, right? It's almost like, if you had like a math textbook or something, he's giving you the answer key, right? He's not making you go through all of the problems with them. He's just giving you the answers, right? So the principles is really useful sometimes for figuring out, like, what did Descartes really think about something because he states it very plainly, assuming nothing else, right? Versus in the meditations, you know, you kind of have to pull it out of where it is in the argument, right? And so we're going to look at specifically a set of concepts related to substance, attribute, and mode, right? These are brought up near around, I think it's like section 50-ish of the Principles of Philosophy. What Descartes says here is very interesting, right? So, you know, up to this point we've talked about, and especially last week, we spent a lot of time talking about Cartesian dualism, right? In dualism, we characterize as the claim that there are two fundamental classes of stuff in the universe, right? There's thinking stuff and there's extended stuff, right? Okay, so now we have to get a little bit more sophisticated with this distinction, right? We have to make a distinction between absolute substance and finite substance. So we have to think about, like, what does the concept of substance really mean, right? And so, like, what do we mean when we say that bodies are extended substances or that minds are thinking substances, right? What do we mean specifically by the substance part of what we're saying, right? And so I guess actually before we go to the bottom of this column, let's do this section in the top right really quickly too. And the three essential words to remember, if you only remember 3 words from today's lecture, you should try to remember substance, attribute, mode. And be sure to write down these definitions, right? These definitions are important because this is how Descartes thinks about these words, right? And we're going to see other philosophers will say something very similar to this, right? But slightly different. And so we need to make sure that we are capturing all of the specific details of Descartes' account. Okay. So let's begin with substance, right? Substance is what we predicate of. And this is an old Aristotelian definition for those of you who have already taken ancient Greek. If you don't know who that is or what that is, doesn't matter. It's okay. So below each definition, I've tried to write an example. So example here is fire is hot, right? And in a sentence like this, right, X is Y, right? There is a predicate, you know, like a property, hot, and then there's the thing that it is predicated of, the thing that you're saying is hot, right? Which is the fire. And so Descartes' definition of substance is the thing that we're talking about when we talk about its properties, right? So like this marker is red, right? What is red? Well, it's the substance, it's the thing that all the properties are attached to in some ways, right? The substance is the bearer of the properties. The substance is the thing that holds all the properties together, like the fact that it's like this specific thing that's red and not, you know, something else. Like, why does it exactly have the parameters that it does, right? Okay. So for early modern philosophers, almost all of them are what we would call substance metaphysicians, which means that they have that they think about substance as describing the basic nature of the universe, right? So like, what is the universe? Well, it's the thing that we talk about, right? It's the bearer of all of these properties, right? Okay, So substance is a very kind of abstract idea. And the point is that substance has a kind of independence, right? This thing that's red is independent of this other thing that has a little bit of blue, right? And a little bit of black. And so substance in Descartes' theory explains how we have individual objects, right? And properties depend on substances, right? If there were no marker, there would be nothing here that would, be the bearer of the properties when we say that the marker is red, right? And so you have kind of like a line of dependence that goes from mode to attribute to substance. And so to say that these figures are substance metaphysicians is to say that they conceive of the universe ultimately as a kind of substance. And that, then you can give more particular descriptions of what kind they are. Because we're going to see, like in this week as well as next week, Cavendish and Spinoza are also substance metaphysicians, but they disagree fundamentally with Descartes about his conception of substance. Okay, let's move to attributes. So an attribute of a substance is an essential property, right? So this means that it follows from the nature of the substance that it has these properties, right? And our examples here are dualistic, right? Bodies are extended, right? Extension is the attribute of substances, material substances, right? And so one way to think about it is that, like, you don't need to do an experiment. You don't need to, like, go out and see if bodies are extended. You just know that because it belongs to the definition of what it means to be a body, right? And you might think about the analog for thinking substance that minds think, right? For Descartes, that is their essential property, right? That's what makes minds is that they think, just in the same way that what makes bodies is that they are extended, right? So these are essential properties. They never change. They're always the same. Bodies are extended even if there are no bodies in the universe, right? Because it's about its essence. It's not about its existence, right? And this is going to be a fundamental difference that we're going to have to discuss all throughout the semesters, the difference between essence and existence, right? The essence of a triangle makes it so that its interior angles add up to 180 degrees, even if there are no triangles in the universe. The Pythagorean theorem holds, even if there's nothing to which it applies, right? We can do mathematics about numbers that are larger than the number of bodies in the universe, right? And the question isn't if we actually do that. The question is if it's possible to do that, right? The question is not about actuality. It's about possibility and necessity. And we think about these as being modal categories, which means it's related to, like, is it actually the case? Is it possibly the case? Is it necessarily the case, right? All of these descriptions are linked up to certain kinds of modal categories, right? Okay, and then finally we have mode. You might also hear modification. Those are equivalent. These refer to contingent properties. So contingent means it could have been otherwise. So properties that can change all the time, right? So two examples here, following our sort of dualistic theme and how we've explained it. I can say, I like green tea, right? That's not an essential feature of a mind. It's just something that's actually true about my mind, right? It is probably not true of everyone in the class, right? It's not all minds like green tea, right? It's I like green tea. My mind does. It's a judgment that I make that I like it, right? So this is contingent. It could have been otherwise. I can also just change my mind and not like it anymore, right? And then similarly, our extended analog is the baseball is traveling at 45 miles per hour, right? It could travel at 44, it could travel at 46, right? And so on. So substance, attribute, mode, right? Now we're going to go back over here to this bottom left portion that we left out earlier. And now we have to be even more fine-grained because we have to make a distinction between absolute substance and finite substance. And this comes from a kind of theological question, right? If what we mean about substance, if the essence of substance is that it exhibits a kind of independence, right? Then the independence exhibited by God's creation must be fundamentally different from the kind of independence that God has, right? So, like, the independence of, this marker, I don't know why I grabbed a different one, but this marker, right, is, relatively low. Like, it could be snapped in half, it could be broken, all these sort of things, right? And so its power of independence exists, right? It is independent of other things in some ways, but it's also a low power of independence, right? Under certain conditions, those powers of independence fade away, right? In the same way that, like, the wax in Descartes' wax example melts when it's next to the fire. But features about God and God's independence are eternal, right? Because it's God's nature to be omnipotent. And so we must draw a distinction between absolute substances that can only refer to God, because God is the sole thing in the universe that, is not like under God's dominion or caused by God or dependent on God in some way. But then there's this other class of finite substances, right? These are things that have a kind of independence, right? Maybe independence from other finite things, but not the absolute independence that is exhibited by God, right? And importantly, what Descartes says here is that we equivocate, right? We use a word in two different senses, right? When we talk about the substance of God and the substance of bodies, right? Because the substance of God is eternal and can never be affected, whereas the substance of bodies or the substance of mind is dependent on some way, on God's grace, right? Funny story really quickly. There was a Cartesian monastic tradition of essentially praying to God that he continued to allow the universe to exist, right? Because the idea that all things are dependent upon God is saying that God didn't just engage in a creation like at moment zero of the universe, right? The Big Bang or something like that, right? But that matter is continuously dependent on God, right? The idea of a matter or a universe or creation that did not depend on God in any way whatsoever was unthinkable, right, to these figures. So God plays this continuous role in creation of ensuring that everything in the universe stays put, right? It doesn't just get blinked out of existence like that because God, got tired or something, right? And so, yeah, there were these monks that would engage in, long bouts of prayer, essentially pleading for God not to blink our universe out of existence, right? And so then, at the second class, the class of finite substances, this is where all the stuff that we talked about with dualism holds true, right? What kinds of substances are there? Well, there's minds and there's bodies, right? What are their attributes? Well, the attribute of minds is thought, the attribute of bodies is extension, right? And what are the modes of ideas? What are the ways that it's modified? We'll just think about particular ideas like green tea or something like that, right? That's one way my mind is modified. It attends to a particular thing that is contingent. And then similarly, in our example up here, you can think about modes of extended substances as like motion and rest and so on. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about, and I'll be really brief here because I know that you have a lot of videos for this week, is just some consequences of the analytic method or Descartes' skepticism, right? Descartes' skepticism is that we as finite substances can have knowledge directly about finite substances, right? We can maybe know some things about the essence of God, right? But the nature of God's wisdom is inexplicable to us as finite creatures. That's just what it means to be finite, right? Is that you do not have the perspective of God, right? You can only sort of infer from your current position, right, what God must be like for your world to be that way, right? And so what's revealed in that conversation about substance is that Descartes is a rationalist. He does believe that the fundamental truths of the universe are things that we can arrive at through pure reason, but that the results of this procedure are very limited, right? We do not have access to, the nature of absolute substance. We don't know what it's like to be God, right? We can only postulate it from our human perspective. And that's why we equivocate. And that's why these two layers of reality are fundamentally distinct from one another, right? And so all of the, religious truths can go up in the absolute substance category, and all of the scientific truths, or at least quite a lot of them, can go in the finite substance category, right? And this is part of Descartes', dualist idea, his idea that, you can sort of accommodate the religious people for what, they say that is in essence true, and natural scientists, right? But, it means that we're limited, ultimately, right? Similarly, part of, I think, Descartes' response to Amo and Elizabeth is to say, we can know the nature of mind, we can know the nature of bodies, but we cannot know the nature of embodiment. Why? Because we can only break it down into mind and body. And so we can explain from a bodily standpoint how a nervous system works, how blood works, how you communicate electrical signals throughout the body. Descartes had a whole theory of this in his Passions of the Soul, which is an extra credit option for those of you who are interested. And he also thought, you could explain it from the minded standpoint. You could say, like, you have this idea, I want to raise my right arm, and then you go raise it, right? But you don't have access to this third standpoint, right? How they interact with one another, right? That's the standpoint that only like God could have, right? We are minded substances, so we can know minded substances directly, and we can know bodies indirectly. We could never know how they connect in the same direct way that we know facts about our own mind, right? And that's what makes Descartes somewhat of a skeptical philosopher, even though he is a rationalist. And some of the philosophers that we're going to discuss later we'll discuss as radical rationalists. Why are they radical rationalists? Because they believe that you can directly know the thought and position of God simply through the project of pure reason. We're going to see this especially in Spinoza and Leibniz. I hope this video was helpful for you and that you've had a great week. I apologize for going a little over Thank you so much. Bye.